Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'ai l'honneur de partager mon temps avec l'honorable député de Louis-Saint-Laurent, mon ami et collègue. It's an honor for me to stand today to speak about this Opposition Day motion. I will echo the comments made by my friend from Scarborough Rouge River. As a Greater Toronto Area Member of Parliament, we were horrified by the attack yesterday, and our prayers and our thoughts go out to the families affected, the people that were tragically killed, and the 14-plus injured, Mr. Speaker. It struck home. He was stopped most effectively by the Toronto Police out in front of the building I worked at Young and Shepherd for 5 years with Procter & Gamble. And fortunately, our team there, the people I worked with, were fine, but there's families that are struck by such a horrific act. So I think we all echo those sentiments today, Mr. Speaker. But moving from shared sentiment to my speech will be directed on the disaster that this government is presiding over on our border. And you hear ridiculous language like Canada's going to be closed off in an island, we're demonizing people. That is highly divisive and unfair, Mr. Speaker. Actually, by allowing our system to be eroded, to allowing trust to be eroded when we don't even enforce border laws, Mr. Speaker, over time will actually mean less Canadians have confidence in our immigration and asylum system, Mr. Speaker. So what the Liberals are presiding over is a period where we could see fewer Canadians see this as the positive that it is, Mr. Speaker. And to suggest that following the rules is somehow unreasonable just show how devoid of leadership this government is. And I'll use my few moments to talk about, because last year there was about 23,000 illegal crossings. The minister admitted to the term that it was illegal at committee, but you see them bend over backwards not to suggest that. We have a process for asylum claims, Mr. Speaker. We have a process for refugee resettlement. All sides have worked on that, and all sides up until this government have followed the rules. So the exceptional work done by my friend, the MP from Calgary-Nose Hill, brings this issue to the House for a solid debate, and that's what Canadians expect. They don't expect buzzwords like welcome to Canada. They don't expect suggestions that we're trying to turn Canada into an isolated island. We all see the tremendous benefit to our immigration in Canada, to our fair and rules-based refugee and asylum process. What's happening now is an erosion of that, Mr. Speaker. So my colleague has brought 4 different ways. Make sure our agencies are properly equipped. They are not. I will show you how that minister has allowed that to happen. We've heard about the Prime Minister's irresponsible tweet, just trying to show the world that he's not the President of the United States. He's caused a problem that they now send ministers down into cities in the U.S. to try and rectify, rather than the Prime Minister providing any responsibility about clarifying our rules and our fair-based process. It was irresponsible grandstanding by the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. That's right. The social services costs, which I will show, is billions of dollars, Mr. Speaker. And the Quebec Premier has been putting them on notice that they need millions more because of the inaction. And then my friend from Calgary-Nose Hill wants a plan tabled by May 11th. As you'll see from my remarks and from using the government's own information, Mr. Speaker, there's been no plan other than hashtags and faulty suggestions that somehow by saying it's fair to follow the rules, we're going to close Canada off like some isolated island. That's hyperbole of the highest order. That's just hiding their failure on this file. I'll start off by first saying, my friend in September of 2017, when there were already problems with people not going to proper border checkpoints in accordance with the Safe Third Country Agreement that the Liberal government of Jean Chrétien negotiated between Canada and the U.S., my colleague asked a simple question about should we not update the loophole in this agreement. That minister, Mr. Speaker, said, quote, "The Safe Third Country Agreement works fantastically well for Canada," end quote, Mr. Speaker. We see that it's not working fantastically well because it's being exploited. But just not even a year ago, when we're already seeing Manitoba, Quebec, provinces having to struggle with the challenges of people not following the rules, they're suggesting, no problem. He has not even raised it as something that needs to be updated with his counterpart, the Homeland Security Secretary in the United States. His own department, Mr. Speaker, this shows the minister's incapable hands on this file. His own department, a few months before he said that in the House to my colleague, suggested in a memo from his deputy minister that, quote, despite strong collaboration amongst Canadian and U.S. agency counterparts, a major security or humanitarian threat could create an urgent need to revisit existing policies, end quote, Mr. Speaker. Those existing policies, that's the Safe Third Country Agreement. Right. So these documents from the minister's own department are leaking out, showing, contradicting actually what he's telling Parliament. His department's saying, well, we're talking with our U.S. counterparts, things aren't working too well. If we see another surge, well, we're going to have to revisit urgently. Yet the minister in the House of Commons said fantastically well, Mr. Speaker. And I see his parliamentary secretary is here. I'm hoping he reports back on this, Mr. Speaker, because I don't have confidence in this minister. My colleague from Calgary Nose Hill, later on in October, had the minister at committee, and she responsibly, because she knows the file very well, talked about a 40,000 case backlog to the Immigration and Refugee Board, Mr. Speaker. Those are people, many of them legitimate refugees, now waiting because of a backlog caused by their inaction on the border, Mr. Speaker. So my colleague asked about that at the time and said, were there enough resources? In fact, the previous speaker, the member from Scarborough Rouge Hill, asked the minister, are there, quote, mechanism, timeline, and resources in place, unquote, to handle this surge of illegal crossers, Mr. Speaker? The minister at that time reassured everyone. He said, quote, we've done it with the resources we have. It's been a question of being a little more efficient, finding innovative ways to deal with this, Mr. Speaker. Basically suggesting to us that there's no problem here. We're handling it. At one point, he said in an interview, we have to be a little more nimble, but we can handle this surge. We don't have to change anything. In fact, in that October 5th meeting, my colleague, the capable MP from Calgary Nose Hill, asked, have you spoken to the United States, this is last October, about closing the loophole in the Safe Third Country Agreement? The minister once again said, quote, we haven't done that, Mr. Speaker. So we have a Minister of Immigration being told repeatedly over the course of a year by his department, Minister, we have a problem. When the minister appears before parliamentarians, no problem at all. This is working fantastically fine. We just need to be a little more nimble. That's not accurate, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to you, when he's suggesting it's not working. And I'll show you why. Here's perhaps the most damning piece of information that I'd like the minister to tell this House about, because it's a briefing memo from his deputy minister. His deputy minister, Mr. Speaker. So while he's reassuring parliamentarians and Canadians that there's no problem, move along, what is his deputy minister saying? Quote, with no new funding allocated to the IRB in Budget 2017, the Refugee Protection Division will be unable to keep up with the volume of claims, even with anticipated efficiency increases of 20%. By the end of 2021, this will lead to a 133-month delay. Wow. 11-year wait time, Mr. Speaker. 11 years. How is that fair to any Canadian, any asylum seeker, any refugee family, any family trying to use the system in the way it's meant to be? 11 years, Mr. Speaker. If that is not an admission of failure at the highest level, while he's telling the House of Commons and committee, everything's working fantastically well, Mr. Speaker. Here is the kicker that Quebec is already worried about, and Canadians should be too. The same note then suggested individuals waiting in the backlog will still continue to utilize social supports, including education, social assistance, and interim federal health. For 2016-17, these were calculated at $600 per month per claimant. Therefore, in the above scenario, social support costs for the inventory could climb to $2.9 billion for 4 years between 2017 and 2021. Mr. Speaker, if we use the 11-year wait time that the minister's own department is warning him about, you know what the cost to the Treasury is? of many provinces? $8.2 billion, Mr. Speaker. $8.2 billion would pay for some of the national pharmacare program they're talking about, Mr. Speaker. But it's a sign that they're not running the system fairly. It's time for them to be honest with Canadians.